Great. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming along to the 5th incarnation of the Complexity and Development Seminar Series, where we discuss the big questions around opportunities for complexity-aware development, taking advantage of complexity or developing methods for capturing complexity in our work, and hopefully doing so across the different disciplines that are... Whoa.
Let's go.
So I'm not starting over, right? Okay. Great. So the previous lectures are all online, so please find them if you haven't seen them. They're all really fantastic. And this one will be as well, so recommend it to your friends. Basically, the big questions we're asking our speakers to speak to around whatever specific topic they're choosing is complexity best thought of as a metaphor or as a science? And what are the implications for that? What are the new approaches and methods that are being derived from complexity and complex system science that can be applied to the field of development and the practice of sustainable development? And what are the opportunities and barriers to supporting more effective complexity-aware practice in the field of development? So I'm going to hand over to Marina to introduce Pedro. And after his talk, then we'll have a bit of Q&A and try to structure a bit of that discussion around sort of these larger questions.
Thanks, Eric. Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to introduce Pedro Prieto Martin, who is a researcher in our digital and technology cluster here at IDS. And Pedro started his academic life as a software engineer. So part of the spirit of this seminar series was to bring in different disciplinary perspectives, different engagement with the ideas of complexity. So Pedro can do that from his engineering background. He spent some time working with Hewlett-Packard. He then spent some time in Latin America, where he worked on ICTs and how they link to governance. And now that he's here with us at IDS as part of the digital cluster, he's currently working on a project with DFID on frontier technologies. So hopefully he's going to take us through a journey of all those different aspects of his work around complexity. And he's going to simplify it all into Simplexity, and I hope you're going to explain what that actually means.
Okay. Is it needed to explain this title? That's not anybody. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity to share some of the insights from the work we are doing at the digital and technology cluster. So this title is intended to be some kind of mnemonic. So an easy keyword that will help you to remember the most essential or different things from this presentation. So this Simplexity² is meant to represent the fact that when we talk about complexity, very frequently, so we have, in fact, like two simplicities, okay, to take account of, and two complexities, yeah? So we will see what it is about. And the other thing, these three, we will see as part of the presentation what it is intended. So let's start. Complexity science, one of the things that I want to let you know is that complexity is not such a new thing. So in fact, I think it is just the last way to refer to something that I would call like proper thinking. So trying to adjust our understanding of reality to how the reality, in fact, works. And the reality is quite complex. So as such, the complexity science gives us explanations of sorry, I tried not to read, but yeah, so tries to provide us with explanations for this messy world that surrounds us and the complex phenomena. So for this reason, complexity science is sometimes called like the science of ambiguity, the science of unpredictability, but also it is the science of common sense. So to some extent, complexity science offers us scientific explanations of things that we, to some extent, already know. So we are used to see the things being quite complex in the world we live, but we are not able to express. So my hope is that the very few ideas that I am going to share with you will sound quite natural. The intention is that to share some very essential ideas about complexity, and they should help us to be a little bit less scared of that complexity monster, and to understand a little bit better complexity and how to handle it in development. This is important because, as the former chief economist of DFID likes to say, so this is the reality of development. So it is complex, it is ambiguous, unpredictable, dynamic, and usually this is the narrative and how we conduct a lot of our business in this sector. And such a dissonance cannot be healthy. So what I am going to present is partly the result of some research that we have done. So as part of MABC, we were looking at adaptive practices in ICT for governance projects. Also, I am participating in this Frontier Technology live streaming, which is a program that enables country offices from DFID to experiment with frontier technologies like Internet of Things, 3D printing, drones, alternative internet, batteries, etc. So the idea is to create a safe space where they can experiment and then potentially include the use of these technologies into their programming. This program, by the way, got the UK Civil Service prize on the most innovative program last year. So this is good news. I think, it is well deserved, but we have still to do much more things. And finally, we are also participating in a new program which is intending to support USAID and DFID precisely to link the practices of adaptive management with the monitoring, evaluation, and learning processes and tools. So let's start. So we are going to have like 4 different sections. The first, I will try to introduce the why of complexity in development, or rather the what for. So why it is important that we complexify our work. The second would be like some very basic notions about what is complexity in development. So what is the smell and the color of complexity, so we can recognize. I think it is worth that we spend then some time looking at this contradiction of this difference between the reality and our practices, so why there is this problem. And finally, I would like to talk about how to approach complexity as part of our work. Okay? So let's go here. And here we are going to see these 2 simplicities and 2 complexities. There you have the 2 simplicities. So we have one that we can call the simplicity on the near side, and the other would be the simplicity on the far side of, what do you think is this mountain that we have there? You got it? It is complexity. Yeah? So this is representing some kind of problem that is worth solving. So it could be like improving the access to AIDS medicines in some region, or getting sanitation for all in a city, you name it. So the Y axis represents this difficulty of the problem, the complexity it has, the dynamism, and what do you think the X axis represents? So it represents the knowledge, our capacity. So what this shows is that when we have no knowledge about the problem, we normally have like very naive ideas, very happy solutions. We think we have a silver bullet and we try to do things. And in fact, we tend to waste well, we tend to produce a lot of waste of work that will not be useful, that will not bring anything. So, but as our knowledge starts to develop, we start finding the difficulties of the subject. And we have to make a lot of effort muddling through this messiness to reach some kind of understanding of the issues. Yeah? But when you are on the top, you are still not really able, not even to communicate it properly, because you have gone up there, so you have such a complex thing, you think that your solutions need to be complex as well. So you need to still invest more time, energy, if possible, to reach the simplicity on the other side of complexity. Yeah? So for sure, there are problems which are more simple, there are problems which are just complicated, or rather, a complex problem will have components which are just more predictable, more linear, while there are others which will be dynamic. So why it is so important to try to go that far? So this gentleman, I guess you know him, he has some ideas. So he says something like that focus and simplicity has been his mantra. You can read. So it is harder to be simple than complex. You have to work a lot, but once you get to this other side, he says, you can move mountains. And it is interesting, he said that 20 years ago, at a moment when important analysts were recommending to close Apple to avoid harming the interests of the shareholders. He did not pay attention, and in these 20 years, by going to this side of simplicity, he made Apple what is now. But that's a very different field, so let's look at more concrete things. So one example would be what Danny was commenting in the previous seminar. So how, after in the context of Myanmar, by trying this kind of approach, a movement-based approach, he was able to create some sustainable change at scale that would have been impossible probably without this approach that he reached. And I am sure that it took him time and experience and the life to be able. Or the case that was presented in the other seminar by Tzu and Ang, where when Deng Xiaoping 40 years ago, he inherited a country which was in a pure mess, and he probably had to realize that if he wanted to get 1 billion Chinese out of poverty, he would need to try many things in many places and keep the best. And this is the approach that Tzu described of this directed improvisation. So, yeah. There's something missing here. Anybody will be able to tell me what is missing? We said there were two simplicities and two complexities. So we are missing one more. And this is the second complexity. We have it, all of us. It is ourselves. So we could say that there is like one complexity in the world, which is messy and dynamic, etc. But there is also some kind of complexity in us, because the way we think, the things we remember, the thing we understand, the thing we feel are so, well, we are a complex system as such. And our senses and everything we are is quite problematic. So here, as you can see, more than 180 different biases, which are called bias, but they should be called mind errors or brain errors, because this is what it is. So you see things that did not happen, you remember things that were not happening. So whenever we are looking at some problem, we really need to be aware of what we have with us. So these biases have probably like some utility as the humans were developing so much time ago. So the idea is that there is too much information in the world. So we need to be able to filter what we pay attention to. There is additionally not enough meaning. So we need to connect the little dots that we have. Additionally, we have to do it very quickly because, well, right now it's maybe not that dangerous, but at that time it was needed to react very quickly. And finally, we have limited capacity on what to remember, so we tend to just skip the part that is important. And this means that we have confirmation bias, we have the IKEA effect, we have many, we can discuss them later, but we are very limited and we need to be aware of this. And this is happening to us in any work we are doing. And as Abraham Maslow, the one from the pyramid, probably you know him, he likes to say that if the only tool you have is a hammer, it is tempting to treat everything as if it were a nail. And what he's referring to some extent, is that while the brain is one of the most fascinating things, that the human brain in particular, that have been created in this world, it is very plastic, it has a capacity to find patterns of meanings in everything that happens around us. So when we are born, we have nothing inside, and we are able to learn languages, to get a culture, to get many things, but it has a limitation. Once the brain has been programmed into one culture, into one way of thinking, it is very, very difficult to make it work against it or to reprogram it. Yeah? And so each of us is the result of the story, the place we were born, etc. And if we have got used to use like the hammer, like to look at problems like they are complicated, it may be very difficult to then, when we have to face complexity, to change to a screwdriver or rather this kind of multifunctional tool that would be required. Yeah? So that's the why. So what for? Why do we want to understand complexity? And it is because we can move mountains when we are able to reach this other side, in development as in other domains. So let's have a look at the what dimension. So one of the most reference models, so Danny was explaining it a little bit in his seminar, is this sense-making framework from Dave Snowden, who differentiates between different categories, 5 categories. Actually, recently he introduced like a liminal space, meaning that instead of 5, now it is 7. This makes sense because the ultimate intention of his model is to show what kind of strategies you can play, so moving from one space to another in a way to solve complex problems. But it is quite messy, I would say. So let's have a look at it with some concrete example and get the most important aspects. So one of them is that always when you look at complexity, you are always looking at some kind of problem. Yeah? So the world is complex, but it is the fact that we want to understand it, to somehow do something with it that makes meaningful. So we set the boundaries, we project the meaning. Yeah? So and this model is intended to be used with problems. There are these 4 main different, actually the 3 I would say. So the example here is a hand pump. So it is very easy, I would say, to install a hand pump. Anybody of us could with little effort. What is more complicated, so this is an area where you need some expertise, is to make sure that water is reaching the water pump. So you may need to get the water from some place, make some installations, filters, whatever. So you need like some engineer doing this kind of work. And what is complex then is to achieve that 1 year after you have installed it, the water pump is continuous working. So at development, we are very, very, very good at installing water pumps. We are reasonably good at getting water out of them, but I think in Tanzania, 30%, 70% of the water pumps after 1 year are no longer working. Yeah? And actually this picture is from one of the projects from the FTL. We will talk about it a little bit later, which actually is trying to approach this kind of problems to make sure that water pumps are sustainable. So the idea of this model is that for sure the strategies that you are using, once you recognize what kind of problems, what kind of issue you are looking at, need to be adjusted accordingly. Yeah? And all these problems have a dynamic nature. And they are dynamic because, one, the context where we are operating keep changing. So the plan that you did at the beginning of a program for sure will not work. The military are very aware that there is no plan that resists the contact with the enemy. And nonetheless, in development, as in the army, very frequently we try to keep with our plans. So one thing is, the context keeps moving, but also there is something which is dynamic, which is our own capacity and knowledge. So this effort that we were doing to understand the problem and to develop our capacity to handle it, it may be through technological development, through scientific knowledge, it may be just due to familiarity, to relationships, to many things. So keep moving this. So it is not like you do it once and you have it solved, but you need to keep doing. So anyway, this diagram is quite complex. I recommend you to spend some time thinking of it, but I wanted to give you one for you to remember, which is a little bit simpler, but I think it is better transmitting. So it just has 2 dimensions, and what it says is that if it is clear and stable what you want to deliver. So if you are producing a piece of software, is what the client wants. If you are in development, is what your intervention is meant to do. And how you deliver it, in that case you are in this simple space. But as soon as it is dynamic, it is unclear, it may be changing, then you need to be acting accordingly. And that's, again, so this thing, and sadly, this is where we keep assuming that we can act in a simple way, while we know that the complexity in which we operate. Okay, so let's have a look at this problem of this distance between simplicity and complexity in development. So these troubled relationships, because probably you know this book. It is from Ben Ramaringam, the cluster lead of, and a big part of this book is describing the problem of the development industry coming to terms with complexity. It is analyzing how we learn, how we strategize, how we get organized, etc. But somehow I have the impression that there is a little problem because it is very much concentrated on the aid industry. So it is looking at it like it is a problem of aid, of development organizations. And I would say that this is a much wider problem, that it might be like something bigger. And for that reason, I want to have a look at from 3 perspectives. One would be a historical view, another a cultural view, and finally some institutional view. So this is intended to just stimulate our conversations afterwards. So let's have a look at this historical view. And when I say historical, I mean really historical. So we go 1 million years ago. So what humanity has been doing, because complexity was already there before we arrived. And so from the moment when we started using our first tools, the development of language, cultures, our games, and well, last year we had iPhone X or 8, or I am not sure. Yeah? All this time, somehow complexity, complicated things and simple things were part of us. And through all this time, our capacities somehow to handle complexity, while at the very beginning there were very, very few things which were just simple. Making a fire probably was complicated to complex, and basically all this was the domain of chaos, so we could only think of gods, etc. So all this time our capacities have been getting increased. If you pay attention, the scale is logarithmic, meaning that the closer we come to today and the deeper we go, this is getting like much more accelerated. And that's actually something important, because what is happening right now, we have reached a point where we are pushing the limits of what we are able to do. So we have got this incredible technological development, and we are facing a lot of complex issues and complex possibilities, yeah? And I would argue, we will see right now, that to some extent, our capacity, so we have excelled at some kind of technological development, so we are pushing the limits of complexity by having increased capacity to do complicated things, but at very basic things like, I don't know, so fairness, good governance, poverty, these very basic things, respect, fairness, equality between, so many things that should be kind of already more advanced, we are still fighting with them, yeah? So these capacities, I would say, are quite unbalanced, and we are reaching a point with climate change, etc., where we are really in trouble. We never had so much capacity, but we are really facing interesting times. So why could that be? In fact, this simple, complicated, complex, I would say, have been object of the reflection of humans for a long time. So we have there Plato, one Greek philosopher, I don't know, 2,500 years ago. He was reflecting about this. He talked about these intellectual virtues, doxa, which was the common opinion, episteme, like science, knowledge. It is referring more to the mathematics and that kind of abstract knowledge, and techne, which was the crafts, but slowly gave, this is where the technology started. So somehow what we see is that we are covering these more easy levels, but complexity was not really included. But happily, we had also Aristotle, which was much more of a scientist. So he was the first person who systematized empirical science, which said that starting from a certain point, and especially everything that had to do with humans, you needed some kind of practical wisdom. So simply science was not enough. You needed to pay attention to more nuanced details, like relationships, like understanding the whys. So while the first forms of knowledge can help you to know what, where, who, if you want to know why, what for, in the interest of whom, so this all sounds like very much Robert Chambers, but so for sure this is this promises. So the problem we have is that the king of philosophers for our Western civilization was Plato, and Aristotle was forgotten for probably like 1400 years. So he disappeared, and the development of our civilization, which at some point came to dominate the globe, was based on the ideas partly of this man. So, but he was just systematizing some things that others had said before. But he was quite a strange man, I would say. So I wouldn't consider him, because he had this idea of the cosmos, this split. So there was this ideal world where the real ideas were somewhere, and then you had the form, the reality in the world. But the truth and the beautiness was all in that kind of abstract world. He also considered the human as divided. So he said, we have the soul, which is here, is the mind, which has access to knowledge, and then we have the body. And this is something that he did not like so much. So body was really. Also, he imagined like that God, the eternal principle, etc., he identified it with reasons. And in fact, Plato, the ideas of Plato were taken by Christianism some centuries later, and were incorporated. So this dualism was taken into many of the ideas of Christianism. In the first centuries, there were actually theologians who said that Plato was like God, it was Christianism for the educated, while, well, the things from the New Testament, etc., was for the normal people, but that in fact it was the reality. And this sacred language was one of the weirdest things that this guy thought. So he had in the academia, there was this thing written on the door. It is said that let no one ignorant of geometry enter this. So he thought that mathematics and geometry at the time was like the sacred language of the universe, that by knowing mathematics you were able to discover the secrets and affect the world. So this is, to some extent, absurd idea, but actually he was right. So we will see later. But once these ideas were taken by Christianism, also the Western civilization slowly developed this attitude to nature. So there was, again, a split between humans and nature, because nature was a creation of God for the humans to benefit. So there was this obligation to conquer nature, treat nature as a machine. This is something that would happen along the centuries, so especially when the scientific revolution. So the fun thing is that especially this idea that through mathematics you could understand better the world is something that we took very seriously in this part of the world. And when the scientific revolution happened, so this enabled us to conquer the world. But as we know, so this was not intended to handle complexity very well. So we excel in using the hammer. And my ancestors, the Spaniards, decided to go to America and they used the hammer. And other ancestors went to other parts of the world and they were using the hammer. And finally, to some extent, now this Western civilization is part of the way we think in the whole world. Is there, this is something interesting, but I am not sure how are we at the time. We are running, so we can discuss this later. I can give you some reference, but the way we approach, we are obsessed. Since we think humans live here and the world is there, we are obsessed with setting objectives, goals, creating models, do some planning. It is the brain who does, it is the intelligentsia, thoughts at the top, and then you use the will to implement those plans. There is this illusion of linearity, predictability, etc. And very quickly, there is alternatives to this, or there was only this way, so it is difficult to say. But, well, we have some kind of counterfactual here, and it is the traditional Chinese. Now, for sure, everything got mixed, yeah? But I would say that the way this civilization developed was like very different to us. So they have a much more appreciation where we see actors and we think that things are happening. People who grew there due to Confucianism, to Taoism, Buddhism, they tend to be much more appreciative of relationship between things. Yeah, and well, let's not. There is this Neo-Confucianism, which is a synthesis of all these other philosophical traditions in China, which is surprisingly. So they talk about Qi, which is the energy and the mass of the world. They talk about Li, which is the form, the patterns of ordering. And when you look at these things, which are like 1,000 years old, the similarities between that and modern complexity science are really surprising. So just to say, so the institutional view is very quickly, you remember, so this is us, our brain, which has been programmed, and we just need to be aware that the same limitations that we have to act in a different way to the one we have been programmed to are also happening at the institutional levels. I would say even more. So once an institution have learned to think in a way, and we are all part of this Western world, of this planning, of this implementation, so it is very, very difficult to change. So what I intended to say is that this is not a problem of development as such. It is a problem of the whole worldview we are in. And let's hope China recovers part of its roots. So how to do complexity? So again, Tzu and Ang. I tend to change the vocabulary. Yeah, okay. Was saying in a seminar that it is good to say you need to be adaptive, but the real challenge is how to become adaptive. And I want to very quickly present this complexity tree, where we have the roots, which are all sciences are part of it, but we have seen some components, neo-Confucianist, cognitive psychology, complexity science, so would be like the sources of the knowledge that enables us to look at complexity. There is a lot of maths, there is a lot of technology that can be used. And then somehow in this tree there would be like approaches which can be different, which could be contextually appropriate or not, and probably like a lot of tools and techniques. Yeah? So these are the different seminars that were given, and to some extent the ideas that were presented there represent some of the approaches that you can take to look at different problems and use this complexity awareness to solve them. There would be a lot of tools and techniques, like from participatory techniques, some tools, some, you name it. But I wanted to have a look at what is at the core, the trunk of the tree, some kind of principles, values, mindsets. So this is partly what Robert Chambers was talking about. And here, part of the work that we were doing in this project from MAVC, so we were looking at initiatives which try to use technology to address problems of governance. So that means that they included very different kinds of complexity. So making software is complex, but integrating it into a solution is even more complex. But making it part of a development project is even more complex. And well, running it as part of a DFID program, that's already crazy. But so it is a complexity to the fourth. The thing is, this gave us the opportunity to look at very different domains who are approaching these complex issues and try to find somehow the main principles that they are using. And we came up with these two main things. So if you want to look at complexity somehow, you need to have this process of continuous improvement, which is enabling you to very quickly validate if what you are doing is adding value. So it is incremental early value generation, iterative. So be able to constantly, through cycles of experimental learning, validate if this is bringing you somewhere, or if you should continue, or you should change, pivot, if you should close. So this is things that are happening on startups, software development, and more in programs, development programs. So I was talking very recently with some guy and with a project, a program of feminine empowerment, economic empowerment, and it was fascinating how much of this they are slowly introducing as part of adaptive programs. And this kind of work needs to be done by empowered people. So that means that somehow it is not enough to have individuals doing the work, so you really need to come to create some kind of teams. It can mean very different things. So in the case of TANI, somehow it is more this alliance of different actors, but in many cases, the focus that development has on individual persons doing some work, staying 1 year in a country, then leaving, and that's not the way to do it. And then there is this embeddedness, which means that these people really need to have a strong contact with what is happening. So the customer or the users or simply the context to follow things that are changing. So, okay, I intended to explain it with one example, but I think we can just progress. We are on time, so let's move to the end. If you want to know something about obliquity And I would just say that these are like general principles that need to be adapted to the situations and which need to be applied at different scales. So, for example, if we have a look again to the proposals that Danny was doing or Tzu and Ang, so somehow a lot of this intentional networking and participation that Danny was proposing, somehow it is related to this embeddedness, and the learning and evidence is also part of these values. So, and also what Tzu and Ang was proposing of this top-down encouragement of the local governments to experiment. So somehow it is like one strategy, this directed improvisation, to motivate, to incentivize lower level governments to act in such a way. So, and yeah, with this, we come back to the beginning. That were the ideas that I thought could stimulate some discussion. I tried to focus on things that are not the ones that are usually told. Yeah, so that was it. Okay?
Wow, excellent. Shall we start with some questions? It's a lot to take in. Need some time to process. Right.
Thank you, Pedro. Covering a wide span of areas, and sort of, I think my head is still spinning a little bit, but very, very interesting indeed. I have a question about sort of your diagram on sort of the historic sort of overview. I was looking at that and I thought, well, there seems to be a progress narrative built into that diagram, which in the sense that you saw, as I understand it correctly, sort of you saw that, you know, as over time, as human capacity sort of an understanding increases, you know, there's a larger area of issues which you can consider simple, others are, you know, the complicated where the experts come in. So the amount of complexity seems to be decreasing in the diagram. And I thought, hold on, in my experience in terms of learning is actually the other way around. The more you understand, the more questions emerge, and the greater sort of understanding of complexity you seem to be gathering. So is there sort of this, is there a progress narrative built into complexity science thinking? And should we really be thinking about that diagram in terms of sort of more and more dimensions? So this is a two-dimensional diagram, but actually things are spinning sort of into the third, fourth, fifth, and the dimensions.
Sure. Another
question?
I just wonder what you meant by, you said that studying complex systems sometimes leads us towards something which seems like common sense. And I didn't know if it related to getting over that hump of complexity and you end up back seeing things as simple, but maybe you could just expand on that.
Any more? Or one more question? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so if I understood your question was about that it seems that complexity is getting reduced rather than getting growing. Not really because of, so this is just like a game, this diagram, so it's not based on any empirical work or anything, but if you pay attention, so this is the logarithmic scale, meaning that while at the beginning complexity, the complexity that we were able to look at and get busy with was quite reduced, yeah? In fact, what is happening here, so we have gone from 100 here to already close to millions. So this is just a representation, but somehow by advancing in our capacity to face new problems, we are in fact opening the space of complex things that we can look at. So that's the idea. But again, this is just like a toy to motivate just thinking, but for sure there are many more dimensions included here. So if I may make one comment of something that I did not mention. So you know this game, Go, yeah? It is a game that is played in China. When I was studying computer science 20 years ago, I remember two things about this. One was that I was told by my teacher, well, we don't know if there is aliens out there. So aliens, like intelligent beings in other planets. But if there are, we can be sure that they will be playing Go. because Go is such an elegant game where of patterns, etc. And the second thing, anyway, that I remember is that they said, and it is so complicated that it is almost impossible that we will be able to make computers play Go easily. And I am not sure if you are aware, but last year, well, some years ago, humans already were defeated, but half a year ago, what is interesting is that somehow a new computer was created where simply we did not have to explain the computer absolutely nothing. So you were just telling him the basic rules and just playing with itself, yeah, in 3 days was able to already overcome the capacity of humans. Yeah? So I just want to put attention to this incredible development, that technological development that we are having, which is really enabling things that were almost impossible, like to predict the weather, to predict the crops. In the past, it was almost impossible. You would make some kind of statistical studies and you would get to this knowledge after years. It is essential because insurance depends on that, food security depends on that, etc. And now we have satellites around us, we have APIs, so it is available for any startup. What I want to point out, the attention is that our capacities to handle, this was one of the questions of this series, to look at complex problems in a different way, and to some of them, to like solve them by brute force, like because we can, yeah, is increasing a lot. So this is opening a lot of possibilities for development. So this kind of using satellites to check if there is going to be problems with food in a certain region is something that is already being done in Kenya. So, but this is going to accelerate, and yeah, it is very strong. The second question was about common sense, what I meant with that. So it was simply this notion that sometimes you may feel frustrated because of what science explains you about the world you are in. So especially if you look at economics, for example, the way the whole models work, a lot of the predictions, the assumptions that they have, you have to be individual, yeah, there is no cooperation, it's just one form of egoism, of competition. So there is, so a lot of the reality we live in and the things that sustain the world, our families, so these are usually not very well accounted by sciences. And sometimes these alternative approaches, so these complex look at the dynamics of systems, offer explanations that simply sound, yeah, make sense. Yeah, so that was the intention, that somehow, very frequently, complexity science provides you with these kind of insights.
I think that's a really important thing to explore together. I mean, anyway, I'll leave that. So just one quick question. No, I've lost my question.
Well, the answer is yes.
Yes. Okay. So I think what I understand is like one of the keys of what you're presenting here is that for you think complexity is about the creating of solutions. Right? So it's not necessarily function of the system, but it's like how complex is it to get a solution to that problem? You said in the beginning it's about framing around problems. So I wonder if that's in tension with other ways of approaching complexity as something, you know, that's part of a system, and then solutions work within that versus complexity is the solution, or the solutions are complex or simple or something. So that'd be interesting. But also the role of that second part of simplicity, the second simplicity, is that about framing elegant answers to challenges in such a way that they become common sense, so that like really profound answers seem obvious once you know them, but it's, you know,
yeah,
impossible to get to them until you do. So anyway, I think there's something interesting to explore there, but let's take a couple of more questions.
Hey, thanks for such a great presentation. You're making me think about common sense, because I've thought about and used this word and experienced things which seem really complex as common sense. And I was thinking, well, actually, maybe the issue is that it's easier for humans to process complexity than it is to process hundreds of, iterations of numbers or factors or whatever it is that we need to do. So it's not so much that it's simple, but it's easier. That actually we naturally process all of these things. And you think about people when they're assessing risk, even basic stuff like crossing a road. We don't sit down, work out the parameters, compute them, whatever it is. We just appraise the situation. That's much easier for us than to do a risk assessment. So I'm just sort of playing with that a little bit, that actually it's not so much that complexity can be simplified, but just that it's easier for us. And that once we recognize that, then maybe we can develop strategies to work more effectively than we do.
Sure.
Piggyback on that. Just as you were saying that, I was thinking, how does that link to kind of like cognitive biases, right? When you're talking about how our brain kind of is processing things, what's kind of within us to maybe compute information in certain ways, and how that might link to cognitive biases, and if you see any kind of within that space, any connections to your work around complexity. You had shown that diagram of all of the different types of information and kind of ways that we process that information. To me, that isn't about cognitive biases, but it can be maybe overlaid on, I don't know if you've seen the wheel that also has kind of different cognitive biases. But yeah, was that specifically the cognitive bias wheel? That one that you had that side? Oh,
yeah,
okay, cool.
That's
I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit on like whether you see anything from your work kind of in between that space that we've just picked up on.
Yeah, I just wanted to know if you could give us some examples in terms of the kind of technological improvements or innovations that you were analyzing in the research, and how I'm struggling to see the connection with how those innovations are using this complexity approach, or they are not, or if you're if you have kind of a comparison about the impact of different technology innovations in governance, respect if they are more simplistic views about the change they want to achieve, or came from a more complexity kind of approach. I really wanted to know a little bit more about the cases that you were analyzing.
I am a horrible note taker, so I'm not sure. So I will start from the end. But yeah, with regards to the use of technology for different programs, so on governance, what we are slowly learning is what things do not work. Yeah? So a lot of the use of technology for governance, if you see the results of the whole Making Our Voices Count program, which was a 5 years program, a lot of the conclusions is, well, we were just too naive, too optimistic, this is difficult. Yeah? And somehow what I was researching was partly something like that. So I was researching on the frustration of people trying to move forward these kind of technologies, and in most cases failing. But the process of trying to adjust the technologies and integrate them and cooperate with actors, etc., is such like very complex intervention. And this is the kind of things we were looking at. Yeah. So, and normally with innovation, so there are these cases where somehow some technologies offer some potential, yeah, and usually that can be quite straightforward. The challenge is how to integrate it into some processes that will be sustainable and that will work. So, and much of the work we are doing on the FTL program is supporting this pilots and teams to work in such an agile way and to be able to move as much as possible in short time. Regarding the cognitive biases and what he was saying, so for sure, what Danny was saying, we have been designed to find patterns, to recognize faces everywhere. If you get several things there, we see faces everywhere because that was important for humans to see if anybody coming close to him was aggressive or it was friendly. So we have a lot of pattern recognitions models like hardwired in us, but many of them are biased. So he was saying, well, we do not know, we do not do a risk assessment, and indeed, so it is very easy for us to know that if we are playing, what is this game, roulette, or that if there was 3 reds, the next is going to be red rather than black, when it is absurd. So we are actually quite bad at estimating risks and making predictions. So there is so many things that affect us. So yeah, on the one hand, we have to recognize that indeed we are great at recognizing patterns. On the other, we have to recognize that due to our biological and evolutionary origin, not always it is working. Yeah, and again, we are reaching a point where we have been able to create things that are even better than us at recognizing patterns and making use of it. This could enable new approaches to many things, to science and to things. Then there was Eric, your questions, but we can start some kind of dialogue. So not so much question and answers. So it was this something about framing complex answers.
Yeah, I was wondering.
Elegantly, so that was like interesting. And you said something about solutions.
It seemed to me that at the heart of your presentation is a framing of complexity as about problems, or as about the process of getting a solution to a problem.
Not necessarily, so the complexity is there. But what I am saying is that usually if you are not, this is this thing of if one tree falls in the forest and there is nobody listening to it, did it make noise or not? So with complexity, it is, I think in the process, so it does not need to be a solution. So you can approach a complex system and situation just with trying to understand what is happening. Yeah. But this intentionality is somehow part of the whole process of understanding. So I think it is good to differentiate actually between system thinking and complexity science. Do you know what is the difference? So usually system thinking, you are looking at, so it is the same thing, let's say, but one is with much more perspective and looking at it with historical perspective. So while in system thinking, you are looking in the short term, trying to understand the situation, which is dynamic and changing, but somehow it is kind of stable. So you are looking at, in these cases, it is very much like problem-oriented. It is, you are looking at some systems to try to understand, and usually to see how, we in Europe, we try to steer the system to do what we want to do. Something more healthy would be to find our place, or what we can, what is the tendency to see how to adapt or how to make use of it. While complexity science is looking at these systems evolving and recognizing how at different scales, at different systems, we are constantly changing, but there are patterns of behaviors. There are ways in which things interact with each other that remain constant. And then you can somehow like extract some kind of laws of how systems work to some extent. So it is like complexity science is the science of history and the study of complex systems. Yeah.